Okay, welcome to Thomas Nagel, What It's Like to Be a Bat. Quick summary. Well, as you know, this won't be a quick summary. It'll be hopefully a helpful exposition of Nagel's position. So let's have a look. Thomas Nagel, what is it like to be a bat? This, of course, is Thomas Bagel. What is it like to be cream cheese? And that's about as far as I'll go with bad dad jokes today. Thomas Nagel, born July the 4th, 1937. He's an American philosopher, university professor of philosophy and law. His main area of philosophical interests are legal philosophy, political philosophy and ethics. He is probably most well known for his critique of material reductionism, and particularly material reductionist accounts of the mind, which we find in this essay, What It Is Like to Be a Bat. In What It Is Like to Be a Bat, Nagel argues that consciousness has an essential subjective character, an intrinsic and essential. I'm emphasizing the word essential. It is essential. It's not something added on to the characteristic. It is the nature of the very characteristic. It is essentially subjective, and this he describes it as a what it is like aspect. He states that an organism has conscious mental states if and only if there is something that is like to be that organism, something it is like for the organism. I'm certain you'll be all very familiar with that quote. That's the quote that sort of sets us off throughout the rest of the article. So let's put this in context. Within the mind-body, within the philosophy of mind, we have the mind-body problem. And we need to be really clear what we mean when we say the mind-body problem. Philosophy of mind and mind-body problem are not the same thing. Okay? Philosophy of mind is the entire discipline of philosophy that considers the mind. Within that, there is what is called the mind-body problem. And this is simply a debate concerning the relationship between thought and consciousness in the human mind, on the one hand, and the brain as part of the physical body, on the other hand. It's not a problem with, it's not the problem of is there a mind or is there a body. It is specifically the problem about the nature of mind and its relationship to physical body. Okay, so according to Nagel, consciousness is what makes the mind-body problem really intractable. Intractable is a great word, intractable, where we're talking about unsolvable. Not simply, we've got to get this really clear, not simply that it hasn't been solved yet, and when science develops some new technique or some new computer that's going to be able to take us a little bit further, it will be solvable. But instead, by its very nature, by its intrinsic nature, its essential nature, it is subjective and it is unsolvable, intractable. Descartes' conclusion to the mind-body problem, as we know, is substance dualism. However, by Nagel's time, and substance dualism was for a long time, or at least dualism was for a long time, the accepted understanding of the mind-body problem, that the mind was distinct from the body. The mind, as in Descartes, was immaterial, and the body was material. However, by Nagel's time, the empiricism of the scientific revolution had led to a general rejection of dualism in favour of a monistic physicalism, materialism. Thought, or specifically consciousness, remained a problem, precisely because it wasn't empirically verifiable. And this is what is known as the problem of consciousness. Now, with Smart and physicalists like Smart, you get a drive towards saying, well, thought is verifiable because I have a computer screen and I can hook the brain up, and when you think something, red lights go off on the computer screen or a graph goes up, and that is verifiable. We can see on the computer screen that physical manifestation of the thought you're having. But of course, that physical representation is not the actual thought itself. And it can be very tempting to fall into a physicalist, to succumb to so to speak, to a physicalist agenda of saying, oh, there you go, you can verify thought. But that is not the thought, that is just a manifestation of thought. In the same way, behaviorists who wanted to explain thought in sort of physically verifiable phenomena wanted to try and sort of say that behavior was completely explainable by the physical manifestation. So, for example, anger was explainable by punching someone. And we get the likes of crude behaviorism, where they tried to argue, I think that J.B. Watson was a proponent of crude behaviorism, trying to argue that there is no such thing as anger as an immaterial process even of them, or event in the mind, or in some sort of mental arena, as Descartes sort of spoke about the mind as an arena, but rather there was simply hitting someone. We haven't gone into behaviorism in great detail. It was much more relevant to Armstrong in last year's cycle. I made Armstrong's text available for you online. You can read that. We have had some discussion of behaviorism. It is worthwhile at least understanding that that's what behaviorists were trying to do, and that there are varying degrees of how behaviorists thought to explain behavior as a physical phenomena. Anyway, let's take it back. Thought, or specifically consciousness, seemed to remain a problem precisely because it was not empirically verifiable. This is what is known as the problem of consciousness. Quite simple. In fact, consciousness is only verifiable from a first-person perspective. In other words, the only person who can verify a conscious experience is the person having that conscious experience. And even then, that can become tricky when we get into questions of memory, but that takes us onwards to outcome 2, and when we're talking about memory as a way of verifying awareness and consciousness, particularly in Locke and in Hume. Now, modern neuroscience, modern psychology, but particularly modern neuroscience, is challenging the vivacity, the trustworthiness of memory itself. So it might be fair to say that consciousness is not even verifiable from a first-person perspective. Put all that aside just for the moment, put it over there until we come to it later on. But at the moment, let's say that consciousness is only verifiable from a first-person perspective. I know I think, but how do I know that you think? And this, of course, leads to the problem of other minds. It is impossible to verify another mind from a first-person perspective. We can only argue for other minds from analogy. Is this just a semantic problem? I think this is one of the first things Nagel tries to deal with. He begins his article by observing that the current favoured way of explaining mental phenomena is reductionism. He recognises several attempts to reduce consciousness within the context of a monistic, a single framework, a framework that reduces everything to a single explanation. The most obvious and the most relevant for us is physical reductionism, which is obviously, as the name suggests, the attempt to explain everything in purely physical terms. With respect to the mind-body problem, this means that consciousness would be explicable in purely physico-chemical terms. This is what we get in SMART. Sensations, which is what he refers to, and which he conveniently conflates with the word consciousness. SMART admits consciousness is a problem, and then throughout the rest of SMART's article, he is almost desperate not to use the word consciousness. He wants to use this word sensations, which I think it's fair to say the word sensations, when we think of sensations, we think of touching, feeling, seeing. The word sensations implies a much more empirically verifiable concept. So I think Smart is very deliberate in his use of the word sensations. I think he's maybe a bit disingenuous in using the word sensations in a conflated way with consciousness. All right, but let's put that aside. For Smart, sensations, which he conveniently conflates with consciousness, are nothing over and above brain processes or physico-chemical processes. Okay, we know that from Smart. Now, Nagel notes that every reductionist, and Smart is a reductionist, he is trying to reduce the mind-body problem from a dualistic perspective to a purely monistic physicalism. One. Nagel notes that every reductionist has his favourite analogy from modern science, which they use to try and demonstrate how consciousness is just another name for brain processes or physical chemical processes. For example, and the examples he gives us are drawn from a range of physicalist writers. One of them we see is in fact the analogy that Smart goes to, lightning and electrical discharges. So for example, water is just another name for H2O, but this does not make water something above and beyond. Nagel also refers to the lightning electrical discharge problem. This is the analogy that Smart likes to use. However, Nagel argues that these analogies ignore what makes the problem of consciousness unique. More to the point, as he goes through the article, and particularly towards the end of his article, and in the end of this little movie, and the end of the PowerPoint that goes with this movie, he becomes much clearer about identifying that the analogy, a lightning electrical discharge, and let's be clear, I'm not drawing an analogy between lightning and electrical discharge. I'm saying here is the pairing lightning and electrical discharge, and here is the pairing sensations, consciousness, and brain processes. So what Smart is trying to do, and most of these other physicalists are trying to do, according to Nagel, is draw an analogy between these two pairings to show that electrical discharge, lightning equals electrical discharge is the same as consciousness equals brain processes. Now, when you first see that, it appears quite a strong argument from analogy. But when we are presented with arguments that are made by analogy, we need to make certain that the analogy actually holds up, and that we are not dealing with a false analogy. And that is exactly what Nagel is going to tell us is occurring here. Now I'm just flagging, I'll put a pin in that for you, keep that in your mind, and we'll come back to that in due course. At this moment, he just says that the analogies ignore what makes the problem unique. So what does make the problem of consciousness unique? Why is it different? Why is the pairing consciousness and whatever different physical brain processes, why is that a different type of pairing to lightning and electrical discharge? So Nagel begins by recognizing that consciousness is a widespread phenomena, but that it's difficult to say what provides evidence for it. He says, an organism has conscious mental states if and only if there is something that it is like to be that organism, something it is like for the organism. There is that quote again. I've put it in twice. Okay? This is the subjective character of experience. Nagel argues that reductionists attempt to explain mental phenomena Nagel argues that reductionist attempts to explain mental phenomena that ignore the subjective character of experience fail to present a satisfactory account. So, and then we have his quote, if physicalism is to be defended, the phenomenological features of experience must themselves be given a physical account. But when we examine their subjective character, it seems that such a result is impossible. The reasons is that I think that might meant to be the reason. You have to check the text. The reason is that every subjective phenomena is essentially connected with a single point of view. And it seems inevitable that an objective physicalist theory will have to abandon this point of view. And that's the end of the quote. We'll have to abandon this point of view, i.e. we'll have to explain it in an objective way. We have to lose something that is essential to that phenomenon, i.e. its single point of view. This leads us on to really wanting to unpack what we mean by subjective and objective. Now, Nagel distinguishes between the subjective and the objective. He recognises this in the distinction found in Jean-Paul Sartre. He doesn't mention Sartre, but he mentions the terms, and I don't speak French, so apologies for those who do, poursuivre and ensui. Sensui? Sounds more like a P. I don't know. Anyway, so being for itself, subjective, and sui, being in itself, the objective. As Nagel observes, here's the quote, every subjective phenomenon is essentially connected with a single point of view, and it seems inevitable that an objective physicalist theory will abandon that point of view. Okay, you've heard that quote a couple of times. You should know it yourself. You should be able to use it. But more to the point, you need to understand it. And that's what I'm going to try and... maybe you've grasped the difference between subjective and objective and why subjective is an intractable problem to consciousness. Maybe you've grasped that, but for the next couple of slides, that's what I'm going to be trying to really unpack. Just note, Nagel doesn't deny objectivity. It's really tempting to think that the examiners have given us some really simple black and white. Smart equals physicalism equals objectivity. Nagel equals subjectivism, rejects objectivity, rejects physicalism. That's just not true. That's far too simplistic. More than simplistic, it's just wrong. Okay? Nagel doesn't deny objectivity, i.e. that there is objective knowledge. He's happy to talk of empirically verifiable data as objective. He is happy also to talk of physical data and physicalism. He even suggests at the end of the article that maybe there are good reasons to believe that the mind and that consciousness is physical. Okay. But he is just trying to say that we cannot explain the mind, or we cannot explain consciousness in objective terms. and in the sort of reductionist terms. To fully explore this concept of subjectivity, Nagel turns to the example of a bat. Now, you've seen the name of the article, it catches people. I had a group of year 10s looking at a range of philosophical articles the other day, and one of them burst out laughing. She was on Google and she burst out laughing and said, I found a stupid article here, it must be a joke article. It's called What It's Like to Be a Bat. The poor girl probably wishes she had have kept her mouth shut, because I then chatted with her for the next 10 or 15 minutes about the article and about how the importance of the article. Why a bat? Why did he choose a bat? Was it just the first? Was he sitting in his office and a bat flew by? No. Basically, he chooses a bat because their experience is so vastly different to ours. And this makes the problem he's trying to demonstrate really vivid. If he had have chosen, another person, the way we experience things is so close that it would have made it harder to drive the point home. But a bat doesn't have the same sensations, to use Smart's language, as a human. So we look here. Humans see with visual stimulus. Bats use echolocation. Echolocation. That sounds like the right word. Echolocation. So, broadly described as seeing with sound. Bats use sound waves and echoes to determine where objects are in space, and by the sound waves bouncing back, they can create image. It's the same idea as radar. Bats navigate their territory and seek out prey by emitting sound waves or bat calls. They use narrowbands and broadbands. Well, you don't need to know how bats do it, but the point is that the method of experiencing the world of a bat is completely different to a human experience. Now, I'm going to have a little proviso to that in a second. This just makes the problem very vivid. Now, having said that, I don't know if any of you kept up with the news and followed. There have been some examples of people who were blind who have developed a form of echolocation by using clicks and being able to basically send out sound, which as it bounces back, they are processing through they're hearing the echoes, they're becoming highly sensitized to the echoes, and then able to turn those echoes, because the wavelength will tell you how far that wave that you have emitted has traveled before it hit something and then has returned, and that will give you, you can sort of take that information, which is sound information, and turn it into visual stimulus in the brain so that you can see with sound. And that may very well challenge, or it doesn't challenge Nagel's position, it just, if people could do it, would make it easier for them to imagine what it is to be like a bat. It would not tell them what it is to be a bat. And that's the points we're coming up to next. Can't I just imagine what it's like to be a bat? One might ask. To this, Nagel responds, our own experience provides us with the basic material for our imagination. So for me, I see things with my eyes. So that's my experience, and that's how my imagination works. So if I'm now trying to imagine how a bat sees, I am using my visual experience to try and pretend or create in my mind an image of what a bat might see. Obviously, I don't have the facility to do that. let's go back to Nagel's quote. Our own experience provides us with the basic material for our imagination, whose range is therefore limited according to that experience. Insomuch as I can imagine this, which is not very far, it tells me only what it would be like for me to behave as a bat. Yet if I try and imagine this, I am restricted to the resources of my own mind, and those resources are inadequate to the task. That is to say, okay, this is me. That is to say, any attempt at imagining what it is like to be a bat will necessarily use my own non-bat experience as a basis for this behaviour, or for this endeavour, I should say. And then we have a picture of a long-haired gentleman imagining what it's like to be a bat. What about, let's take it one step further. What about if I turned into a bat? Wouldn't that allow me to know what it is like to be a bat? And Nagel addresses this. He says, even if I could, by gradual degree, be transformed into a bat, and there's a point in which why he says by gradual degree, nothing in my present nothing in my present constitution, and that would be the present constitution of any point of degree, any point along this line of change, enables me to imagine what the experience of such a future stage of myself, thus metamorphosized, would be like. So that's what he has said. I'm going to say, moreover, even if this transformation were possible, it wouldn't tell me what it's like to be a bat. Say I was able to do this entire transformation. The bat would know what it was to be a bat, but not the human turning into a bat. Okay? So the bat at the end of the transformation might know what it's like to be a bat, but not the human who started off, nor the human quarterbat, which would be a human quarterbat, which would know what it's like to be a human quarterbat, but not a human, nor a bat, and not any one of the stages, so on. Now you might object that the human knew what it was like to be a human, and then the human half bat, jump to that stage, the human half bat knows what it's like to be a human half bat and a human, and then the bat, theoretically you might say, well, doesn't it now know what it's like to be a bat, a human half bat, and a human? Well, in the transformation, yes. But does it know what it's like to be a bat, an absolute bat? In other words, there's a difference between this transformed, I'll use two words. There is the transformed bat, which has knowledge of being a transformed bat, a half human, half bat, and a human. And there is a distinction between the transformed bat and a bat per se. The bat per se does not know what it is to be a half bat and a human. Its knowledge of what it is to be a bat is different from this transformed bat. Okay, the transformed bat is not actually a bat. It's actually a bat-like object with knowledge of being a range of things, which by definition makes it different from being the bat. Okay, I'll read what I've written again. Moreover, even if this transformation were possible, it wouldn't tell me, I'm about to go and hit my dog. No, I won't hit my dog. I will just transform it into a bat. Even if this transformation were possible, it wouldn't tell me what it's like to be a bat. The bat would know what it was like to be a bat, but not the human turning into a bat. And if the bat still had my human consciousness, which might allow me, to be aware of the experience of the transformation and the experience of a bat, it would not be an accurate experience of being a bat, precisely because bats do not have this experience of the transformation. Right. Subjectivity and the problem of other minds do not necessarily prevent us from believing that another person's experience has a subjective character. Okay? This is called the argument from analogy. Nagel says, we know that anyone who suggests this would be wrong to draw a skeptical conclusion because we know what it's like to be us. He doesn't say we know what it's like to be someone else, but it would be wrong to be skeptical, to be doubtful, that they have their own subjective experience. Now we find this with Bertrand Russell, very famous philosopher, well worth looking up. And Bertrand Russell argues that nothing in science alone can tell us that there are other minds. We need some additional postulate. Russell points out that an extremely natural way to argue for the existence of other minds is by analogy. Okay? Therefore, to recognize that we cannot know what another's experience is like does not deny that they have experience, nor is it to say, I'll just need to correct that later, nor is it to say that such experience is meaningless just because we cannot experience it. Okay, this is an important point. Nagel is not trying to dismiss objectivity, as I said before. He actually doesn't even dismiss physicalism. He just says we cannot know the subjective experience we intrinsically cannot know the subjective experience of another. That doesn't mean that we should be skeptical about them having such an experience. We are led to believe that by analogy. And it doesn't mean that the experience that they're having or that we are having is meaningless. Now here he's trying to address people who Alright, this is what you can hear barking away. This is Paddy. His actual name is Padfoot from Harry Potter. And he gets a little bit lonely, particularly when I'm locked off in the study, and don't get crazy, boy. And so he's out there barking probably at any passing dog or bat. We do get bats in our backyard. As far as I can tell, none of them are Thomas Nagel, but I'll have a good look next time. Sit down there, Paddy. Therefore, to recognise that we cannot know what another's experience is like does not deny that they have experience, nor is it to say that such an experience is meaningless just because we can't experience it. There is a tendency with some physicalists to want to reject or to avoid, is probably the best way of putting it, to avoid subjectivity because they feel that subjectivity is itself meaningless, because if it is the case, if subjectivity exists, then it cannot be verified and therefore it is not meaningful. So this is what This is what Nagel is trying to address at this point. Turn down there, Paddy. Crazy dog. And he says people who deny the meaning of subjectivity or feel that that this way of thinking leads to meaningless basically exhibit what he calls the crudest form of cognitive dissonance. Nagel asks if what we're looking at here is a question of privacy of experience, and the phrase privacy of experience is a phrase that turns up in the philosophy of mind and in particular the problem of other minds. It can be seen as a defense against subjectivism. So on occasions what you see is this idea of people who want to reject the subjective view, sort of saying, well, if that's the case, then no one can know anything because that's just your point of view. You've probably all heard this idea that, there is no truth, it's just everyone's point of view. Well, put simply, this is a view that effectively denies objectivity and restricts all communicatable experience. Restricts it because you can't communicate it, because there is only the subjective experience of it. And this leads to solipsism. I hate saying that word. Luckily, you don't have to say it. You can just write it in the exam. Solipsism. Nagel himself doesn't use the word in the body of his text. I think he uses it in one of his footnotes. But it's worthwhile you understanding it. It is a particular school of thought that emphasizes the privacy of experience, that says, I am the only mind that exists, and therefore my mental states are the only mental states. In a sense, it can lead to a form of nihilism, certainly within morality. However, Nagel wants to be clear that his point is not simply that we can't know what other people think, but that other people think, and that this type of thinking is precisely intrinsically subjective. He is wanting to emphasize that what he's concerned with is not what other people are thinking, but that there is subjective thought, and it is a type of thought. Here's a quote from Nagel. There is a sense in which phenomenological facts are perfectly objective. Okay? One person can know or say of another what the quality of the other's experience is. They are subjective, however, in the sense that even this objective ascription of experience is possible only for someone sufficiently similar to the object of ascription to be able to adopt his point of view, to understand the ascription in the first person as well as the third, so to speak. Let's use a bit of behaviorism to try and understand what is being said here. Here's a phenomenological fact. I am angry. Grrr. There you go. You can objectively say, oh, he is angry. Now you can say that, or Dr. Scott is angry. You can say that because you are sufficiently, he's written similar. I don't know if that's a typo from me, or he said, I would have said familiar. Maybe we should check the text on that. But sufficiently familiar, I'm going to say, to the object of ascription, the object that is being described, anger. Now you have experienced anger, therefore you are familiar with it, which allows you to adopt the first person point of view of what it was like for you. So you are able to offer an objective description of this, as well as a third person, which is to say you're going, oh, look, he is angry. Dr. Scott is angry over there in the camera. Okay. Now, I've just written in red here, just remember this. First person is the I perspective, second person is the you perspective, third person the he, she, it, they perspective. Second person doesn't really get used, it's more of a literary term, doesn't get used so much in philosophy. Objectivity is a direction away from the human viewpoint. There's our next heading. Through the majority of this article, actually what Nagel is doing is unpacking subjectivity and objectivity. So here he recognizes Now, he recognizes that objectivity is best thought of should be there, thought of as a direction. So not as a thing, not as an end point, but as a direction the understanding can travel. There is a real tendency in, say, the empirical sciences or the modern sciences, particularly people who want to argue for physicalism like Smart, there is a tendency to present objectivity as if it is a better form of knowledge than subjectivity, a truer, that it has a certain vivacity that subjectivity doesn't. Vivacity, trustworthiness, truth. So there can be a tendency for the sciences or the physicalist to say, this, well, here's a pencil, this is the objective pencil. Now, what Nagel is recognizing is that obviously I'm looking at this pencil, you're looking at this pencil. We are constructing data, we share data and we share experience so that we can start to talk about the pencil in an objective way. But we are not the pencil. So our objective description of the phenomenon of the pencil is a movement towards objectivity. It is not objectivity per se. That's all he's getting at when he says that objectivity is best thought of as a direction in which the understanding can travel, rather than an end point that the understanding has reached. So Nagel himself is non-committal about the possibility of knowing an object, such as lightning, in and of itself. And so, the point is that the aim of objective knowledge is a type of knowledge that more precisely, that moves. Let me just change that. That moves precisely away from the human viewpoint. So a reductionist explanation of lightning that moves from lightning to electrical discharge makes sense. Reductionism is a process of greater objectivity, less of the human viewpoint. Even to talk about lightning and the experience, lightning evokes the experience of lightning. But as Nagel points out, trying to explain experience does not fit into this pattern. Okay. So subjectivity belongs to a single viewpoint. And this is a quote from Nagel. If the subjective character of experience is fully comprehensible only from one point of view, then any shift to objectivity, that is, less attachment to a specific viewpoint, does not take us nearer to the real nature of the phenomenon, it takes us further away. Okay, the phenomenon, let's take lightning for example. An effort to explain lightning in terms of in objectivity makes sense. It's a movement to try and explain it in a way where we're moving away from the single point of view of a human. Now let's try and explain consciousness in an objective way. So if we take consciousness, which is the single experience or the single viewpoint of a single human being, and we try and move away from the single viewpoint of a human being, we're by definition moving away from an understanding of that phenomenon. So we have two phenomena, consciousness, lightning, and we're trying to explain them using objectivity. For the lightning, perfectly justified, fine. For the consciousness, we are moving further and further away from an explanation of the thing itself. We're moving further from the nature of the thing itself. Hence, reductionist attempts to explain experience, consciousness, thought, as physico-chemical are doomed to failure. Moreover, analogies such as lightning, electrical discharge with, so here's the analogy, lightning, electrical discharge with sensations, brain processes. Remember, that's what the analogies we mentioned earlier are false analogies. Okay, what's a false analogy? Let's be really clear. A false analogy is when a comparison is made between two ideas or objects that seemingly have similar characteristics, but the comparison does not hold up. The characteristics of the two things actually differ in the very area that they are being compared. So, lightning, electrical discharge, sensations, brain processes, they appear to be similar. But lightning and electrical discharge, both objective. Sensations / consciousness is subjective. So we have a pairing over this side, which is object-object. We have a pairing over this side, which is subject-object. So in the very area that they're being compared, they are different. They are not analogous. It is a false analogy. Smart attempts to draw the analogy between the relationship between lightning, electrical discharge, and sensations, brain processes. However, the description of lightning as electrical discharge is a movement from objective phenomena to objective data. The description of sensations as brain processes is a movement from subjective experience to objective data. The comparison of these two pairings is false. All right? So this is something that Nagel alluded to at the start of his article and comes back to now towards the end of his article. And it is a really strong point of evaluation against SMART. So remember that if you get an exam question that asks you to outline and evaluate SMART's lightning example, here it is. And you can use Nagel to do it. Even if the question doesn't explicitly say, compare this with Nagel. It might also be a really, really powerful piece to use in a 10-marker question if it's a smart Nagel type 10-marker question. Instead of just going, subjectivity, problem of other minds. Every kid in the state is going to talk about subjectivity and problem of other minds. Let's be a bit stronger. That's just a dodgy slide. I don't even know why that one's in here. Some conclusions. So, Nagel says, at present we are completely unequipped to think about the subjective character of experience without relying upon our imagination. Now, none of us, this is what I want to just emphasize, because there's a real tendency amongst students to sort of go, Nagel is for subjectivity, he's against objectivity. Nagel is for subjectivity, and subjectivity can't be verified materially, therefore Nagel is not a physicalist. Okay? None of this means that Nagel outright dismisses physicalism. He says, actually towards the end of his article, I think we also have some reasons to believe that sensations are physical processes, without being in a position to understand how they are. We can think of a reason such as the example of Phineas Gage, but we can't understand how it works, not in and of itself. Nevertheless, his point is, throughout the entire article, that the problem of consciousness within the mind-body problem cannot be overcome by any physicalist theory. Now that's what SMART offers us. SMART tries to offer us a physicalist theory to explain the mind-body problem. And Nagel's point is you simply can't do it because of the intrinsic subjectivity of consciousness and these analogies that physicalists like Smart attempt to draw to make their argument. They argue from analogy, are actually based on false analogies. And there you go. So, a whole thing about Batman appropriately finishes with the Joker.